Now, what we're doing is we are considering a biblical appeal, and if you will recall from last Wednesday evening, imagine how different a Christian's life would be if that believer, instead of being frustrated, instead of quitting, or instead of being fired from his job, actually knew how to make a biblical appeal. And thereby open up a line of communication with his boss that would not result in his termination, would not result in him in frustration, quitting, and would completely change the course of his life. Imagine what would happen in a marriage if you had a wife who was not, who did not grow up in the home of a crazed lunatic feminist of a woman, and she knew that having a husband with an extremely strong personality was not a liability but a tremendous asset. That was not something to be upset about, but was something to be absolutely thankful to God for. Because even worse than being married to a guy with a really strong personality is being married to a guy who has the strength of a wet dish rag, or who has the fortitude of cold, overcooked spaghetti. Okay, and that rather than get upset at the guy because he is passionate and excitable and frustrated when he comes home from work, rather than turn around and run to the bedroom or turn around and run to the kitchen, which only aggravates him because you walk away from him while he's talking to you, but you decide, well, I'm not going to take that anymore, and so I square off at him, and so you assume the physical posture of somebody who wants to fight him. That's not the way to do it either. Or let's say you are a teenager and you are in the home of a Christian mom and dad and you have observed them making biblical appeals, and so when you find yourself on the basketball team being dealt with by a coach who is obnoxious, abusive, and embarrassing, you make an appeal to him rather than cry. It doesn't look cool for a 16-year-old boy to go to the locker room, stick his head in his locker and start bawling like a baby because coach said mean things to him. Boy, I could write a book on the things coaches said to me as I was growing up. But imagine what would happen if there were a group of people that were raised in an environment where they learned how to make use of tools that God has given to His children in a wise fashion, so that it didn't need to be years of frustration where you feel like you're trapped in an unhappy marriage, and you feel like you're in prison because you can't say anything, you can't do anything, because every time you say something, you say the wrong thing, because every time you say something, you do say the wrong thing. You actually say the wrong thing at the wrong time, in the wrong way, and succeed only in infuriating and aggravating and making it worse because you don't know how to make a biblical appeal. Or a teenager, the only thing he is ever capable of doing is making his dad mad or making his mom mad, because all he knows how to do is be defiant and obnoxious and irascible, and because he possesses very little wisdom, almost no humility, and he doesn't know how to make an appeal. And what's frustrating is you have two sons in the same family, and one of them gets the keys to the car all the time because he knows how to do it. And the other one never gets the keys to the car because he doesn't know how to do it and he's not about to learn. Okay? What's the difference between the two? One knows how to make an appeal, the other one doesn't. So whether it be in a church ministry, or whether it be on the job, or whether it be in a marriage, or with your parents, or whatever, wow, if people would simply pay some attention to how to make a biblical appeal, so that the person that you were making an appeal to did not believe that you were trying to overthrow them, did not believe that you were trying to undermine them, did not believe that you were rebelling against them, but recognized that this person is trying to help me, has approached me with tremendous humility, and is not trying to persuade me to change my mind. Would never suggest that I change my mind, which is basically spitting in somebody's face and insulting them. You're stupid, you don't know how to make decisions, and you need to make a new decision. No. This person is bringing to my attention some facts that I was unaware of before, bringing certain considerations to mind that I hadn't addressed thoroughly before, and they're not asking me to change my mind. This person is asking me to make a new decision based upon information that I had previously not considered. That's not insulting to anyone. Imagine a general comes into the Oval Office and says, Mr. President, I have some new facts that have just come to me about Rocket Man. And by the way, it turns out that President Trump was not the guy who invented that term. It was several other international leaders at the United Nations that were calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man. Trump, in conversing with them, they used the phrase Rocket Man to him, so he took it and delivered it in a speech, Rocket Man. Okay, so anyway, but imagine a general comes in and says, Mr. President, well, we've just got some new surveillance data from an overflight that I think would significantly bear on the decision that you just made. Would President Trump get mad at him? No, he's not trying to get him to change his mind. He's attempting to give him an opportunity to make a new decision based upon new information. Nobody gets insulted about that. Nobody gets mad at that. Any wife can do that with her husband. Any child can do that with his parents. Any employee can do that with his boss. Maybe it won't work at DMV. I don't know. I'm not sure that it works at the post office. But you understand, basically, these are powerful tools that God has given to us. And we've seen in the Bible that under the most amazing conditions, they were used with great effect, great skill, which produced great results. So, what we have done for the last couple of months is consider this biblical appeal, looking at it from the top down, of the 7 things that have to be present whenever possible in making an appeal. And then we've looked at some case studies about Abigail appeals to David, and Ruth appeals to Boaz, and Esther appeals to the king of Persia, and then Bathsheba appeals to David in his old age. Daniel appeals to the prince of the eunuchs. David appeals to the warden of the prison that he is in, and we've looked at those. But what we're looking at now, specifically you're in a situation and something has developed, and you feel that it's necessary that I make an appeal. A decision has been made that I'm having difficulty with for a couple of reasons. Number one, I just don't think it's the right decision. I thank my boss, I thank my dad, I thank my teacher, I thank my coach, I thank my whoever made a hasty decision, not really well thought out, very emotional, and is basically trying to cram something down my throat. Do I respond to that with stubbornness and rebellion? Well, if you're a typical nitwit fool of a teenager, of course that's the way you're going to do it, okay? If you are a nincompoop employee who goes from job to job to job to job because you can't get along with your boss because you've got terrible, terrible social skills, then of course that's what you're going to do. Nobody talks to me that way. Really? It's been my observation that people talk to people that way all the time. But only fools react the way you do, okay? So you find yourself in a situation and you need to make an appeal. Well, how do I go about that? What do I do? Well, let's consider, first of all, there's a person who is working for somebody else. This would be the closest approximation in our culture to the master-slave relationship that we see referred to in the Bible, okay? So we looked at Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6 last week, Colossians chapter 3, Philippians chapter 4. I don't want to read those passages all over again, but those seem to be the three passages that have the strongest applicability to situations we find ourselves in today. So I'd like for you to consider yourself, you work for somebody, okay? Your boss has just made a decision that has an impact on you and an impact on your coworkers and an impact on his or her ability to succeed at his or her job, okay? And so you're contemplating making an appeal, and before you make the appeal, there's some things you need to think about, because you do not want to react emotionally. You do not want to react emotionally, okay? That's just dumb, okay? To react emotionally, to allow yourself to go hormonal, that's not the way to do it. 5-year-olds cry, okay? Adults don't do that, all right? 10-year-olds get mad. Adults really don't do that. Grown-ups do that, but someone who's an adult, no, you gotta keep your brain in gear when you're faced with significant problems. So let's find the situation where there's an employee, and this would be best represented in the Word of God as a master-servant relationship. So what portions of these three passages that we looked at last Wednesday night have special application to the worker's success in making appeals? Go back to Ephesians chapter 6. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I would like to read verses 5 through 8, okay? Because from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18 onward, we're talking about interpersonal relationships between people. They have their primary application with congregations, church member to church member, but Paul also talks about church members having relationships with people who may not be church members. So we begin reading from verse 5, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ, not with eye service, as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free." Okay? That looks like it covers it. So hang on to that passage and turn also to Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Now, some people, they just can't do this. they're too proud, they're too arrogant, and so when anybody slights them in any way, their response is to go off on people. They just react like Mount Vesuvius, okay, Mount Pinatubo. They just blow, okay. In order to do this, you got to be spiritual. Ephesians 5:18, be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. If you're filled with the Spirit, the assumption is you're humble, okay? And humble people don't react when they get kicked in the belly the way proud people react when they get kicked in the belly, okay? Either verbally or physically. So, Colossians chapter 3, verse 22 reads, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. So, Christian, you're not serving your master. If you're a Christian, you're not serving your master. You're serving the Lord Christ. You're not serving your boss. When you go to work every day, you don't work for your boss. You do not work for your boss. You work for your Lord. Verse 25, but he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. Now, I've looked at Philippians chapter 4. I don't think there's anything in Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 13, which any of us would find is remotely applicable to a person as an employee, as a servant. And so we're not even going to go there. But we'll stay with these two passages. So I'd like for you to think about this. This is class participation, okay? What one or two aspects, considering these two passages that we've reviewed, you're a worker, okay? And most of you here either are or have been gainfully employed for a significant portion of your life, all right? Some of you, you're going to find out what it's like, okay? So what one or two aspects of being a worker, working for someone else, seems to stand out in these two passages? Because Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, writes to the Ephesians, and then this same apostle, under inspiration of God, writes to the Colossians about your relationship with your boss, with your master, okay? So I think, and I may be wrong, and I'd like to hear from you, I think I see two prominent features that I think would be of particular concern to my boss if these two passages are a clue. And because these two features would be of particular concern to my boss, they would figure very highly and be of particular concern to my boss and would enhance my ability as a worker to present a biblical appeal that is more likely to be considered by my boss. Though understand, there's no guarantees. Okay. What indications in these two passages do you think you see? So that if you're going to make a biblical appeal to your boss, there you've got to get your ducks in a row. What seem to be the first two or perhaps three ducks that you better get in a row before you even think about making an appeal to your boss? Because unless these things are lined up, you are wasting your time by opening your mouth. Anybody? Roberta.
In Colossians, where it says, not in eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, to me that says that your boss has to trust you that your goals are their goals, or that you are looking out for their best interest.
Okay. What's the number one way to persuade your boss that this is the case? Go back a couple of words. No, I think coming out of the starting blocks, Paul tells us. Jim.
Well, one way is to show them is you're the first one there in the morning and you're the last one to leave in the evening.
Okay, all right. But let's stay with this passage, Patty. Obedience. The very first thing that the Apostle Paul mentions in both passages, servants, obey. So what is, if he's listing these things in, and by the way, these comments are absolutely dead on, okay? But if Paul is listing these in order of their importance, what's the first thing your boss wants out of you? He wants you to do what he tells you. And if you're the kind of worker that doesn't do what he tells you, forget it. Forget it. And by the way, I don't think obedience is limited to just doing what he tells you. Would somebody care to expand on that? Obedience is more than just doing what you're told. Jimmy.
It's doing what you see that needs to be done without being told.
Doing what needs to be done without being told. You know, I do an experiment around Calvary Road, and I've done it for 32 years. If I see something that I think needs to be tended to, if nobody's around, I may do it myself. I do not want anybody to see me doing stuff. Why? I was the #1 custodian at my first pastorate. And it did not serve the congregation well for the entire congregation to know that if there was a plugged toilet, pastor will take care of it. If somebody needed a brake job, pastor would fix the brakes. If somebody needed new points and plugs, pastor would do that. So I realized when I came here, I can't be doing that. And it's not because I think it's beneath me. It's because people will come to depend upon the wrong person doing the wrong thing, and they won't do it. Okay, so what I would do is if I'd see something that needed to be done, I'd just let it go and keep track of, okay, so that's down there on the ramp, and it's trash. And I'm going to figure out in my mind how many days is that going to be there with people walking by it every day, many times a day, and nobody will see it to pick it up and throw it away. So there's some things that people ought to do without needing to be told. So obedience, I think, is not only doing what you're told, but after a while, okay, it's getting to the place where you do what needs to be done whether you were told to do it or not. Okay? For example, and I know we're dealing with employees here, but let's spill over a little bit. It's the kid who does what he knows his mom wants him to do without his mom asking him to do it. He just knows she wants it done. Okay? Not to brag, but I'm going to brag. I was the kid that emptied the trash without being asked. About the time I turned 13 years of age, I realized that there's 3 things that ticked my parents off. There were 3 things that caused them to rag on me. Okay? And I don't like people getting all over my case. So what I did was I just addressed those issues before they mentioned them. Okay? One was the trash. Empty the trash. Can you guess what the other 2 were? What are they always with a teenage boy? Yes?
Clean your room.
Okay, empty the trash, clean your room. What else? Pick your stinking underwear up off the bathroom floor. Don't leave your clothes in the bathroom after you take a shower. Okay? It was the same 3 things every day. So I realized it's the same 3 things. You don't have to be a scientist to figure this out. And by the time you're 12, 13 years old, boy, if you don't take care of this kind of business, you're just stupid. You need to have your teeth slapped down your throat, because that's just dumb. Okay, I question whether people who do stuff like that don't do stuff like that. I question whether they ought to be fed. Okay, so that's obedience is the one thing. Okay, what's another thing? Okay, Patty? Huh? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Yes. Yes. Stephen? I'm sorry? That's an attitude, and while attitude is important, we don't see Paul majoring on attitude here. We see him majoring on action here. Okay? Not denying that attitude is important, but actions are more important than attitude. Yes, ma'am?
In verse 23, whatsoever you do, do it
Heartily,
heartily.
yeah. That might translate in our culture as being diligent, okay? Being faithful, being dependable, being reliable, okay? So if you do what you're told and do more than what you're told, so let's say your boss makes a decision and it grieves you because you think it's a foolish decision, okay? Anybody here ever have a boss make a dumb decision? I would like to hear what it is. Names changed to protect the innocent. Anybody want to volunteer? I had a boss one time who made the decision to blah, 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 and this is the reason it was dumb. Yes, Jackie? He used what? Ah, commingling funds, huh? Used business money to buy stuff for his wife. Okay. Okay. Anybody else? That's not good. He'll end up destroying the entire company. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
In my line of work, I serve students special needs. It comes with certain rules and documents that we use to get the children the services that they need. Well, our boss, we get sued a lot. That's just litigious stuff. But our boss said some things in a recorded meeting that caused the suit to go completely into the family. That she shouldn't have said, that she knew she shouldn't have said, but she said it anyway.
Well, that was dumb.
Yeah.
How many of you saw the YouTube video of the white police officer pulling over a guy, and it was on his chest camera, and the person didn't get out of the car. He says, I don't want to get out of the car, I'm scared. And the police officer says to the person on tape, you don't need to worry about it, I only shoot black people. The police officer actually said that. You don't need to worry about it, I only shoot black people. He needs to be put down for being stupid. That's just, you know. He was obviously joking, only it weren't funny. Okay? And it was recorded. And it's like, okay. Sometimes bosses, that wasn't a boss making a stupid decision, that was a police officer making a stupid decision. Please, good night. Anybody else have a dumb decision made by a boss? You guys have never had bosses that made dumb decisions? Serious? Yes, Patty.
Well, when my boss was communicating to people, the tenants, and she forgot some information, so she didn't communicate it. I kind of slided out sideways to her, so it wouldn't be noticeable, you know. Give her the heads up without them realizing it.
Yeah. If we had nurses here, you realize what the #1 job description for a nurse is, don't you? They are the people who are licensed to keep doctors from killing patients. And that's really what nurses do. They keep doctors from killing patients because the doctors have such a workload, and they are trained over the course of their medical training to make decisions under duress, to make decisions when they're greatly fatigued, stuff like that. If they don't have nurses on their side, oh boy. So nurses are constantly in the presence of doctors who will say, you know, I want 100 milligrams. Doctor, was that 10 milligrams you wanted? Oh, yeah, right, 10 milligrams. Okay, not 100, 10. Yes, Jim. So they bought unlicensed merchandise that they thought was licensed. I got you. Let me give you an example of a boss making a dumb decision. Probably 40 years ago, the state superintendent of schools in California, tall, skinny, bald guy, I can't remember his name. This came out on the John and Ken show. They had it thoroughly documented. He was watching television one night, and he saw on television a documentary, and the commercial that was aired along with the documentary was a commercial, come to New Zealand. We have the best education system in the world. And then a few minutes later, come to New Zealand. We have the best education system in the world. The next day, I think it was Bill Honig, I think was the name of the guy. The next day, he instructs his secretary to reach out to New Zealand, their Department of Education, and find out what's their approach to elementary education. They get feedback from New Zealand indicating we do it this way. Correspondingly, at the same time, at our Christian school, we had a woman working for me whose name was Beatrice Shirk. Beatrice Shirk used to work up in Northern California near Sacramento, and she was an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool convinced phonics teacher. And she said one day, when the teachers gathered before the beginning of the school year, the principal informed them that the education experts from Berkeley were going to use their school as a laboratory. And what they were going to do is they were going to shelve the teaching of phonics for a program called, I think it was DISTAR. And what it was sight reading, where you do not sound out words according to the sounds of the syllables, but you look at whole words, okay? And she said that she and the other teachers in the school looked at each other, and they met in the teacher's lounge, and they said, I don't care what the Berkeley people want. I'm teaching my kids how to read using phonics. And so they had phonics flashcards buried in the bottom of their desk. And when the Berkeley people came onto the campus, they used their material, and as soon as the Berkeley people drove off of the campus, they pulled out the phonics flashcards. The net result was at the end of the school year, the kids read very well, did very well on the scores, but what the testing was supposed to measure was how successful this new approach was to teaching kids how to read. Only they didn't use the new approach to teach the kids how to read. They used the old approach, pretending to use the new approach. And so the Berkeley test results proved, hey, our new way works better than phonics. And they realized too late that in order for there to have been valid results, they would have had to sacrifice their children. And they didn't think it all the way through. And they taught their kids how to read, and the result was they validated an approach to teaching reading that simply was unworkable. It gave Bill Honig all he needed. We're going to do things New Zealand's way. And that's how 35 years ago the state of California got rid of teaching phonics. 3 decades pass, test scores are diving. They start doing research into finding out why. It comes out that Bill Honig had his secretary reach out to New Zealand, who said they had the best education system in the world, but that was tourism advertising. The reality was New Zealand had one of the worst education systems in the world. Because they didn't teach phonics, they taught sight reading, and it was terrible. It was terrible. And so there is a decision made by a California superintendent of schools based upon a tourism advertisement that he took to be true, verified by a test that measured other than what they thought they were measuring. And those two things together destroyed teaching reading in California for decades. That's a decision that a boss made. Mrs. Shirk made no attempt to, and she confessed it to me. Years later, she confessed it to me. She said, we didn't know what to do. But nobody made an appeal to the powers that be. Nobody went back and approached it. Nobody tried to solve the problem. And I'm not sure if they had tried, I'm not sure anybody would have listened. The schools that I grew up attending had all these grad students come in and testing. And I'm not sure a grad student ever listens to anybody, okay, in education anyway. So we've got obedience, diligence. What other kinds of things? Somebody mentioned it at the outset. We've got this word eye service. What do you think eye service means? Somebody, yes, Sarah. Yeah. Okay, then what would a man pleaser be?
Yes, ma'am.
A yes man, yeah. So basically, these are not good characteristics for employees to have. I've worked around people that will tell the boss one thing, and then as soon as the boss walks out of the room, they'll spout quite a different story. Okay? So if you're going to make an appeal to your boss, you need to be a guy, first of all, who basically does what your boss wants you to do, who obeys. Secondly, you need to be somebody who's diligent. Thirdly, you need to not be the kind of person who basically is political, who is a yes man, who is will conduct his or herself in an unethical fashion. You know, sometimes when you're at work, you find yourself in a situation that you'd rather not be in, where you're backed into a corner and the organization really needs for you to tell the truth, even at personal risk. Guess what you ought to do? You got to do the right thing, okay? So in order for you to make an appeal that's going to be heard, The reason you have to be a person that does what the boss wants, you have to be obedient. The reason you have to be diligent is because of the first requirement for making an appeal. You have to have right standing with the person you're making an appeal to. And if you're not a person who does what you're told, and if you're not a person who is diligent, you don't have the right relationship with your boss to even open your mouth. Do you follow what I'm saying? Imagine what would happen. A lot of people who get disgruntled on the job and have problems on the job and have issues on the job, if they simply took care of this, many of the problems and gripes that they had would simply evaporate. And maybe their boss would actually come to them for input so that they wouldn't need to make an appeal, because the boss would float, I'm thinking about doing this and we're considering doing this. What do you think? Before we do anything, what do you think? Pretty good, eh? Pretty good. So I've never had a boss do that. Well, I don't know. Maybe there's a reason for it. You gotta be the person that does what you're supposed to do, right? Even if you're not asked, all right? And you got to be diligent. And then you got to be, the person who's not guilty of eye service or a man pleaser. Anybody have any observations or comments along this line? As somebody who was in the workplace at one time and had a boss that made incredible decisions? Sometimes a guy gets promoted to a position. Anybody here ever heard of the Peter Principle? There was Archie will like this, but there was a guy who was in the business school at the University of Southern California. His name was Peter. His last name was Peter. And he wrote a book called The Peter Principle. And the Peter Principle is that a competent person will be promoted and then promoted again until they reach the height of their competency, and then they will get promoted one more time. In other words, just about everybody gets promoted one position too far. Okay? And sometimes a person like this, because they're over their head and they really don't know what they're doing, they come in and they act obnoxious and ridiculous, and they're not a good boss, and they are a holy terror to the people that would really like for them to succeed. But their only hope, this kind of boss, that person's only hope is to have somebody that works for him or her that will make an appeal. Anybody here ever had a boss like that? Yeah? Yeah. You guys, you don't want to cooperate?
I was one of those.
You were one of those? Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sorry to hear that. Anyway, I'm reading a book that was given to me by my daughter about the building of the Panama Canal. And it's applicable to this. The Panama Canal cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. The French, who at the time, back in the 1800s, had the best engineers in the world, Eiffel of Eiffel's Tower and those guys, they built they dug the Suez Canal, and they were the best engineers in the world. And when they got to Panama, it was a mess. And a lot of people got prosecuted, and people went to prison, and they messed up the funds, and there was bribery and all that kind of stuff. Well, decades later, the Americans took a run at it, and the first year that the Americans were there, they had blown a couple of $100 million and had gotten nothing done. And then they hired a guy who was, when the two railroads, transcontinental railroads, met with the Golden Spike in Utah, they met. Huh? Did somebody say something?
Never mind.
Okay, I thought I couldn't hear. But those two railroads that met, and they had all the newspaper reporting. Those were both financed by the government, and the government paid them by how much track they laid per mile, how much per mile. And so the tracks were like this, because they got paid by how many miles of track. There, just a couple of years after that, there was a privately funded business enterprise that became the Great Northern, and the guy went straight across the northern states, And that was the only railroad that was profitable. The others went bankrupt several times because they were built improperly and used bad materials and bad engineering stuff. Well, the guy that was the engineer for this private capital enterprise was a self-taught engineer. He had no formal education of any kind. And he was the greatest railroad engineer in the world. And they eventually hired him to build the Panama Canal because the Panama Canal was first and foremost a railroad engineering job. You use the railroad to get the equipment to the ditch, and you use railroads to get the dirt that you've dug out away from the ditch. So it's railroad both ways, okay? So this guy's a railroad engineer, and what he does most of the time is walk around asking questions. He'd ask a question, then he'd ask another question, then he'd ask another question, then he'd ask another question, and he just kept asking questions. Just kept asking questions. Just kept asking questions. So basically what this guy is doing is he is eliciting appeals from people. Whether he realized what he was doing or not, his management style was to ask questions. And he asked question after question after question after question after question. What do you think I should do about this? Should I do it this way or do it that way? You know what he's doing? He's asking the people that work for him to make an appeal. This is essentially what he's doing. And it was a wonderful management style, and this guy ended up getting the Panama Canal built simply because he got feedback from his people. Well, when you make an appeal to your boss, you are providing feedback to your boss. And if you can convince your boss that you're providing feedback to him rather than trying to undermine him and get him fired, then he's much more likely to listen to you. But you got to be the guy who does the work. And you got to be diligent in doing the work. And you got to be honest and ethical, not with eye service and not a man-pleaser. He knows you're going to tell him the truth. Amen? Are you having any challenges in that regard in your new workplace, Ron? Because sometimes different levels of city government and local government can be rife with politics, okay? And sometimes the guy asks you a question, he doesn't really want to know the answer, okay? All right. No one has a comment, observation, or testimony you'd like to share? All right. Pass your attendance slip into the nearest aisle if you would, please.